Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for engaging conversations about the topics that matter most in our culture. If you love nuance, if you want to better understand different points of view, if you're tired of the screamers taking all the oxygen out of the room, if you'll enjoy edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me, you love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. So glad to have a place to talk politics and culture and important stuff without a bunch of screamers. And as always, if you like the show, tell a friend, leave a review, and definitely subscribe. I'm your host, Corey Nathan, and so glad to be joined by our two guests today. Brad Edwards and Bryce Hales are the co-hosts of Everything Just Changed, a podcast that is about good faith participation in community, grace-saturated conversations, and all committed to the common good. I give them a ton of credit for having really impressive, engaging guests, and they have a knack for exploring some great topics, relevant topics, in consistently thought-provoking ways. Brad and Bryce are also pastors at the Table, the Table.
Either way, all of the above.
Yeah, which is, as they put it, rooted in selfless love for our fellow man to such a degree that we are never fully able to achieve it, as they confess, a humble hypocrisy, which I love. All about dichotomies and contradictions held in poetic tension. Brad, Bryce, thanks for taking the time. How are you both doing?
Good. Thanks for having us on here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This is fun.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. So just so folks get a sense of who you are, I wanted to ask about each of your backgrounds. Brad, starting with you, I was fascinated to learn you spent time in the Army National Guard and then served as a chaplain in the National Guard. But you also have all these creative pursuits, a photographer. There was the art underground. Can you tell us a bit about all that and how you got to this point as a pastor and podcast mogul?
Wow. Podcast mogul. That is, I've never been accused of that before. So it's funny. I feel very much like a jack of all trades and a master of none. And so my kind of background growing up was very kind of secular, Midwestern, conservative, generally speaking, but I never set foot in a church until actually after I graduated from college and became a Christian in the end of my junior year in college. And so my whole career track prior to that was actually geared toward federal law enforcement and was a defensive tactics instructor and went to college on an ROTC scholarship and all of that fun stuff. And so it was entertaining if it weren't so painful that how much God just kind of grabbed me by the scruff and yanked me into what he was calling me to do, which is now we're, doing ministry in hyper progressive Boulder County, Colorado. And so it's a slightly different cultural end of the spectrum, so to speak, but it also has given me like a profound appreciation for, people outside of, any tribe I find myself in any given moment, because that's changed a lot too. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, I have some questions about, your upbringing and, when you went into ministry and all that, but I got to know I see, I'm kind of digging those bookshelves, man. Like what are some of the writers that are populating those shelves?
Oh man. Some I'm happy to name and others I'm not, because I try to, read a pretty wide swath of perspectives, but I don't know. I would say just in terms of like influence or what have you, like the ones I'd recommend is I had the honor of being able to participate in Redeemer City to City's fall church planter intensive one year in 2015. And so I got to meet and hang out with Tim Keller, and his books have been profoundly shaping for me, especially right after I became a Christian. The Reason for God was like, I can't even, I'm lacking the words to describe how significant it was. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff up there. I think a lot of pastors see themselves as, pastor theologians. I think I kind of err more in the direction of like pastor sociologist. I'm fascinated by culture. So, whether it's Andy Crouch or Makoto Fujimura, Anthony Bradley, the intersection of culture and faith is very interesting to me. And so there's a lot of stuff up there about that.
That's awesome. Yeah. So David Brooks is, I don't know if he'd be a professional sociologist, but definitely an amateur sociologist. And his work is definitely among my favorite. His columns are just, every week I read his columns, but one of the most influential books I've read over the last couple of years is his recent one called The Second Mountain. And it's kind of at that intersection that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Bryce, did you grow up in SoCal?
Yeah, I born and raised in Orange County, and then escaped from behind the orange curtain.
So you did Westmont for undergrad, graduate work in, how do you say it? Edinburgh.
Yeah. I went to seminary in Scotland because I'm a Presbyterian, so I had to go back to the roots.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Loves skiing, loves a good IPA, loves his childhood sweetheart who you married after undergrad, loves your 4 kids. Hopefully you figured out what's causing it, or are you guys still working on?
Yeah, the fourth one was statistically improbable, but we figured it out after that.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So fill in some of the background and what brought you to this point.
Gosh, I think in some ways, what I would want to say is I have always loved to build things. When I was, a little kid, I would just go down into our garage, and my dad is not handy in the least. And I would just find scraps of wood and start building stuff. And when I was like 8 years old, my parents were doing a remodel on our house, and they took me with them to the architect's office once. And I was obsessed. It was awesome. There's these little models and sketches that he was doing. And so for years, I thought I was going to be an architect. And I was such a dork that in high school, I took drafting classes, like as a high school student, because I wanted to do that. And long story short, God kind of grabbed the hold of my life and led me into ministry. And yet I've always had that sort of building impulse. And so, just as a hobby, I love building stuff, woodworking, metalworking kind of stuff. But I've always been in like startup entrepreneurial ministry context too. So we planted a church in Orange County. I started a campus ministry at the University of Utah. But now here, so I about 5 months ago, I moved to Colorado to work with Brad at the table. And that still continues to be kind of the thrust of my role here in terms of spiritual formation. How do we actually build into people the sort of, heart for following Jesus that radically transforms everything about the way that we live?
Yeah. Yeah. So you both touched upon this a little bit, but I was curious to know for each of you, what point you decided to go into ministry, and what kind of reception did you get from family and friends when you told everyone, you're going to go become a pastor?
Well, I can go first because
go for it.
I'm guessing my reception maybe is a little bit easier. I kind of, some of my story in that regard is that the church really saved my parents' marriage. I didn't grow up in a Christian home for the first several years. And then my parents, I think, were headed towards divorce when the church entered our lives when I was about 7 years old. And so I think just the influence of the stability of the church, but not just as an institution, but the centrality of who Jesus is, was just so important and informative in my life. And then as a high school student, as I was kind of beginning to wrestle with, is any of this stuff actually true? And if it is, it's probably really important. If it's not true, then it's not really even a great place to like socialize. And so I really began developing a relationship with my youth pastor at the time. And so I would say that was like the second time that the church really intervened in a positive, formative way in my life. And it was that youth pastor who first kind of suggested to me, I think God might be calling you to pastoral ministry, which was terrifying at the time because I wanted to be an architect,
Yeah. What about you, Brad?
Yeah. So I didn't grow up in the church, like I said, at all. My parents would have considered, and they would have said, my dad had said many times that he is against organized religion, sees it as inherently abusive. And so when I became a Christian in college, it was on the tail end of being pretty dramatically humbled and having my identity kind of torn down by just the realization that I was not who I thought I was. I was not the good person that I thought I was. And so that, and a year later, when I started feeling called to ministry, the reaction from my parents was this very much like this, like, cool. I don't know what to do with that, but you're going to help people. So go you. It was, it was like, we're supportive because it's you, but we don't understand this at all. And so that was really interesting. And and even to this day, it's always like this thing that kind of pops up every once in a while as a surprise of like, oh, I forget this is a difference here. And because like my primary family in many ways is my spiritual family now. And that has now shaped me as much, like far more actually than the family I grew up with in some ways. And so it's a really interesting dynamic, but my dad is also a military veteran. So everything I did through the chaplaincy and everything, was highly supportive of that too, and because his identity is very much tied up in that. And so there's some common points of, shared experience, but for the most part, it's a fun challenge to navigate for sure.
So you say you became a Christian as a junior, when you were a junior in college. Were you exploring the possibility of a different spiritual route? Like, could you have become, to answer some of what you were struggling with or questions you were grappling with, is there a possibility that you would have become a Buddhist or a Zoroastrian? I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, it was funny. I would have, I described myself back then as an agnostic deist. And basically the way that came out is like, I believe that there is a God, but he sure as hell isn't your God. And I was, not necessarily Pauline in the sense of like going around persecuting Christians and stoning them to death, but I was trying to with my words. Yeah. And if the new atheists were around back when I was college, I would have been like big fans of theirs. And so, yeah, my coming to faith was in the midst of my being having active disdain for Christians and going around and making fun of them like to their face.
Were you flying spaghetti monster guy? Was that you?
Again, gosh, it's so hard to know if I would have like been a fan of that back then, because I absolutely had that attitude. Yeah. But I think I have a better aesthetic sensibility, because like, what a dumb picture, honestly. And I know that's the point, but anyway. Yeah. Yeah.
So Bryce, you've used the term who Jesus is, or to know Jesus a couple times already. And, as we discussed before hitting record, some of our listeners are agnostic. Some may think of themselves as atheist or humanist. That language sounds weird, right? Could you demystify or maybe at least explain what you mean by that?
What I mean about who Jesus is?
When you use language like that, what does that mean to you? What do you hope to communicate both to other folks in the church as well as maybe folks who hear you that aren't believers? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that is unique about Christianity is that Christianity is a historically grounded faith. And so, we can explore that in a lot of different ways, but I think at the essence, the claim of Christianity is that there was a man named Jesus who lived at a certain place in history at a particular time, and he claimed to be the Son of God. He claimed to be God incarnate. And so that truth claim is either true or false. And the way that I feel about that is a secondary matter when it comes to, lots of people have different feelings about Jesus, and that's good. And we want to talk about that and explore that. But the primary question is, he either was who he said he was, or he wasn't.
Right. Lord, liar, or lunatic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, C.S. Lewis famously said, anybody who claims to be the Son of God either actually is that person, or they're lying about it, or they're crazy, And so if Jesus really is crazy, or if he's lying, then I don't think we should listen to anything he says. And I don't think the idea that, well, he was a really good moral teacher. I mean, I don't follow like David Koresh's moral teaching. I don't think anybody claims that we should, right? Yeah. Anybody who claims to be the Messiah and who isn't, we should not listen to them. And so, there's been a couple points in my own kind of life and journey where I've had to really wrestle with the reality of, is Jesus who he said he was? And if he is, then I have to respond to him. And so, like I said, how we feel about that is a secondary issue. But one of my real kind of passions and convictions now in ministry is that I'm not sure a lot of Christians take the historical reality of who Jesus is that seriously either. And so I think a lot of Christianity, and we're probably going to get into this more a little bit later in our conversation, a lot of Christianity is kind of functioning on the premise that Jesus makes me feel good about myself. I think that's a pretty flimsy approach to Christianity. I don't think it's actually Christianity at its heart. So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question? You want to follow up? Or?
Yeah, no. I mean, it colors in some of the blanks here. I want to be sure to. I guess it's because you asked me the question that you did before we started recording. That I'm cognizant of the fact that some people I love and respect and really appreciate that listen to these conversations are like, the hell are you talking about? So to speak, what the hell are you talking about, so to speak? So,
well, I mean, there's another kind of way to even kind of think about what I just said, which is that like, if Christianity is like a way to feel good about myself as a person, then I think that has to be rigorously defended against attacks, or maybe attacks is too strong of a word, but sort of has to be defended against people who say, well, I don't actually feel that way about Christianity. And so who are you to then say that I should feel that way about Christianity? And what I'm saying is Jesus either is the Son of God or he's not. And that truth independent from the way that I feel about it.
Right.
And so I don't have to defend the veracity of Christianity against people. Now, I'm happy to have that discussion and talk about why do you actually believe that this is true and legitimate.
Yeah.
But I don't have to do that in a way that is antagonistic towards people who don't agree with me.
Right. That makes sense.
Maybe one way to put some flesh on what Bryce is saying too is like in my own story and of coming to faith, I had like my own self-understanding and self-awareness, my identity, my dignity, value, and worth just dismantled and torn to shreds because I thought I was this kind of chivalrous, well-intentioned guy that as long as I had good intentions, I wouldn't hurt anybody. And it was on the other side of a bad breakup where my ex in college actually like begged me to let her leave a room when I was breaking up with her so that she could go quote unquote end it all. And I was like devastated because I knew that was the right decision, that we would not work. It was not actually good for her. It was not good for me, but I had good intentions and I still hurt someone bad. And it was because of a friend of mine from high school who pointed out to me the story of David and Bathsheba, who David had this terrible, like took advantage and used his royal authority to sleep with a woman who was married to his friend. And he was caught red-handed and it goes bad. Right.
Yeah.
But it still says in the Psalms that David is a man after God's own heart. And my friend points that out to me. And I am like existentially in this crisis of how is that possible? In what way can David be a man after God's own heart? Oh, well, it's because to the degree that it is, he actually is a foreshadowing of who Jesus is. Except Jesus is the one who is able to actually do the things that David had maybe good intentions but was still compromised fundamentally. And Jesus is the one that actually loves the church so much that he would put his life on the line and dies for the church, dies for God's people in ways that David put his selfishness first. And it's just like, oh my gosh, Jesus's love and selflessness can be my identity. And that is the thing that like changed everything. But that's just sentimentality. If Jesus isn't, if it's not rooted in history, if it didn't actually happen, then we believe a literal fantasy.
Right. So I was going to take this down another path, but you've raised my curiosity about some other things. So there are some either ors in the Bible, and you've both articulated, is it fair to say that either Jesus lived, died, and rose again, or the rest of it kind of falls apart? Is that fair to say?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And if so, okay, there's that. How many other either ors are there? I think we talked the other day about this, the fact that I live in Santa Clarita, in the Santa Clarita Valley, where John MacArthur runs Masters University. And for him, it's either 6 literal 24-hour days, or everything is, he might even say that you're not a Christian if you don't believe that part of it. So for you, how many either ors are there? And what might they be beyond Jesus lived, died, and rose again?
I guess I would say I want to be as generous as possible.
Wait, I got to pause for a second, because Brad has this look on his face like, hey, Bryce, you take that one. Let me see. Let me see how you get yourself into trouble with this one.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Sorry, Bryce, go ahead.
Well, I mean, gosh, we could get into a really deep conversation about, kind of epistemology or the nuances of theology. But I think it comes down to the Apostles' Creed. I mean, what have all Christians historically affirmed? The deity of Christ, that God is a Trinity, that He has spoken to us through His scriptures, that He created the world out of nothing, and that Jesus will return again. I think those are the either ors for me, which isn't to say that the other things don't matter, that the Bible teaches truths that we can study and understand, and we can believe are important, and we can hold them in kind of with a posture of humility and say, other Christians may legitimately read the Bible differently and come down to sort of different positions on some of these things. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to like, where do you draw the line in the sand? Yeah. I would go back to, what have all Christians historically affirmed for 2,000 years?
Yeah. Yeah. What about you, Brad?
Well, I was just going to say, I kind of want to question the premise of the question a little bit, because like Western culture is incredibly binary. It's influenced by Greek dual, the sacred, secular. These are either or categories made ultimate in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And Scripture is a Middle Eastern document. Uh-huh. It is not so dichotomous, and there are a whole lot more neither nors, and a whole lot more both ands, and a whole lot more I have no ideas in Scripture than there are either ors. Yeah. And so like if we only apply that lens, it's actually going to do violence to what both God and the human authors intended with what is written. So yeah, I mean, there are some in there, but we should actually let Scripture inform our categories too, instead of trying to force ours onto it.
Mm-hmm. I just realized that I asked a question that annoys the crap out of me when it's asked of me. It's like,
well, that's most questions pastors get. So
yeah,
that's okay.
So, well, I remember before I actually became a Christian, I've subsequently developed other theological convictions, but not categorical ones like that. There are too many lines in the sand for, and every conclusion I arrive at uncovers a gazillion more questions. But before I became a Christian, I whittled it down to 2 of the most empirically verifiable things to me that would be the least empirically verifiable to anyone else. And those 2 propositions are, there is a God and I ain't him. So that was it.
That's good.
It's a good starting point.
That's a great starting point.
Yeah. So we could go down this rabbit trail quite a bit, because anyway, but one of the other things I was curious about as it relates to family, certainly through your podcast, it's not that you have a particular partisan slant, but you definitely question certain default postures that in the political realm that, if you're among other American contemporary Christians, it's like you're asking questions and exploring topics in such a way that push back against, well, we all kind of are this way, the basic assumptions of American Christendom, if you will. Have you had a chance to get into conversations about social issues, politics with your family, childhood friends? And if so, what's it been like?
Oh man.
Well, yeah, depending on who we're talking about, those go very differently.
Okay.
Like in my own family, immediate family is probably significantly further to the right, but not necessarily more conservative than me, if that makes sense. But like, I think what you're hearing on the podcast is primarily and especially the fruit of having wrestled in a context that is very interesting in how simultaneously homogenous it is. Like, this is a very progressive place. And yet, because it is that homogenous, and it's also lacking a lot of like kind of evangelical subculture breathing down its neck, there's a surprising amount of freedom and openness to having conversations that would be remarkably volatile kind of most any other place in the country. And so there's kind of a freedom and some room to breathe conversationally that I think is really helpful and fruitful. And two, most of the people at the table at our church have come from contexts where that hasn't been allowed. And they would probably consider themselves like post-evangelical in the sense that, you know, this doesn't seem to line up with the Bible that you're telling me to read. And I don't know what to do with that. So there's a cognitive dissonance for them walking into the table or coming to this place that kind of by definition makes that a lot easier.
You know, it's funny you say that, because I remember this had to have been like, it was definitely pre-2004, but by that time I was starting to come to the conclusion that there were primary identifying ingredients to this community, the church that I was going to, that didn't reckon directly with what I was reading in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And it's in a way that's, this podcast is I'm exploring a lot of those issues, and I've been kicked out of Bible studies for asking some of those questions, you know, but I don't know if it necessarily has to do with the questions themselves as much as me kind of being a butt, you know, in the process of asking it. But Bryce, how about you, man? Like, have you had some of these conversations, social, political issues with family and friends that you grew up with?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, you know, in some ways the podcast has been fun because it gives us a chance to talk about these things without and kind of define where we see some of the contours and the nuances. But I mean, I don't know that I'm that different in the sense that, like, you know, I've had conversations with friends and family members that have been really frustrating and gone very badly. And occasionally we've had conversations that have been more productive. But I think my interest has often been almost wanting to kind of take a step back and say, now, what are the factors that are leading to those conversations? Because I've not exclusively, but, you know, I've only been here for 5 months, so I'm still getting my feet on the ground. Before this, my ministry context was in South Orange County, that is, you know, actually more politically conservative, and so that kind of syncretism between, you know, conservative politics and evangelicalism is still alive and well, and maybe not well, still alive, alive and struggling. And so I've often wanted to kind of say, let's take a step back and let's think about, like, what's actually driving the conclusions that people are coming here, because if we're saying that, you know, again, like, as a Christian, if we say that Jesus sort of reorients our perspective on reality, and yet our perspective on reality seems to be more informed by politics than by faith, you know, that's what I want to put my finger on. Those are some of the questions that I'm wanting to ask.
So we've talked about the table. Curious, in starting a new church, if you thought there were unmet needs this church could address, or if you thought the way that we do church in America has been off course in some ways, and you could provide an answer to that. I guess overall, why start a new church, and what's different about the table?
Oh, man. Well, in one sense, there's nothing different about the table in terms of this, we're being a Christian church, right? Like Bryce was talking about earlier, the historicity of the gospel and the person and work of Jesus. The church is just as historically rooted and grounded, and has concurrently existed as long as the gospel has, and even before Jesus came, lived, and died and was risen, right? So the church needs to stay historically rooted, and to answer your question, part of the problem that we're seeing is a lack of historical roots in the church. And with that lack of anchoring, the church gets tossed to and fro every which way by the winds of change and culture. And so on one hand, our kind of intent and hope and also what was kind of lacking in this place was a certain degree of, we'll call it sanctified boringness. Because it can't be. If it's new, it's probably heresy, right? But at the same time, the church is kind of as an institution is both organization and organism, and that means that there needs to be a fresh embodiment of the gospel among God's people in a given place, and so kind of some of the weird dynamics of this place are such that like nobody who lives here is necessarily from here. Very few people are. And so you get kind of like a lot of imported, generally left-leaning white American culture is imported into Boulder County. And the Christians who are here largely don't interact with it. Not many, not all of them anyway. And so that left an openness and this need for a church that was able to engage with the concerns of our progressive neighbors, but from a place that was historically rooted and biblical. And so we just found, and part of this is just like my wife and I's love of hospitality too. We're from the Midwest. Like Midwestern hospitality is like a category of life, right? And so to name the church The Table and to be thinking about this in terms of hospitality and relational and creational generosity, that really struck a nerve and resonated with people here. And so, but then again, I feel like every church plant is also like, it's not just one church plant. It's actually like 5 or 6 church plants, because you end up like learning more about the place as you go, and you're reinventing it the entire time. But what I would say, the biggest thing that we've realized is in this place, and I think this is true across the country as a whole, is that there is a longing for a third way past tribalism and a truth that is actually big enough and transcendent enough to be a source of meaning and dignity and worth for people who differ on many, many things. And that is so rare in culture and society right now. That's actually the church's one job, honestly, is for that to happen as the fruit of preaching and living out the gospel. And so, yeah, I don't know. Is that kind of what you're asking, or?
Yeah, no, you're touching upon it. You're definitely touching upon it. So my buddy Tommy wrote this paper. Actually, some of these questions are in my head because I reread it for the first time in about 10 years. I realized that he wrote it when he was a missionary in Pamplona in Spain. And he was just realizing what the church sent him out to do wasn't meshing with what he thought the gospel, what the imperatives that you might derive from reading your Bible well and in totality. So I'm curious, salvation plan A, salvation plan B, it sounds like you resonate a little bit. So just to fill folks in, the salvation, the plan A, plan B thing, a lot of times when you hear about evangelicals, folks want to convince you that, about what happened to Jesus, but it's more about like, say a magic prayer so you can go to heaven kind of a thing. I'm totally oversimplifying it, but, Tommy was grappling with whether the Bible was saying something different. So curious as to your thoughts about, having read that article, curious as to your thoughts about all that.
I mean, yeah, this is why an appreciation of history and culture is actually super helpful. American individualism said, hold my beer to general Western individualism. And so American evangelicalism has been significantly shaped by, the First and Second Great Awakening, where there was, emotional appeals sprinkled in with a lot of like very legitimate spiritual awakenings, but there's a lot of emotional manipulation that came with that. And this idea that we are saved by praying the sinner's prayer, or our decision as opposed to God's inclusion and invitation, is is part of like more American individualism than biblical Christianity. And that has profound, I mean, your friend who's a missionary is going to be just slapped in the face with that once you get outside of the American context. And I think part of the language of hospitality and the vision for, a theological vision for hospitality at the table is rooted in this idea of covenant, which is the simultaneous, individual God's like pursuit of individual people, but upon and even before salvation often comes through belonging in his covenant community. And so there isn't this hardline divorce or distinction between the individual and the corporate love of God in the same way that we can't single out God as Trinity, as divine community, or the three persons of God. Like right. It mirrors the Trinitarian relationship. And so, I amen to that. And that's part of I think that's a lot of, even if people aren't able to articulate that, I think that's what a lot of people find refreshing. And that's just Presbyterianism too. Like,
Well, I mean, I think when it's pretty clear in the New Testament when Jesus is inviting people to follow him, he's not inviting them simply to pray a prayer so that they don't go to hell. Right. He's saying, I want you to enter into a way of life that is about following me into my kingdom way of living. And my hunch is that, I don't know this specifically, but a missionary going to Spain with the message, like, pray this prayer, say that you believe in Jesus so that you don't go to hell when you die. In the context of Catholic Spain, nominally Catholic Spain, everybody's going to be like, I've done that my whole life. You are not offering me anything here, right? But Jesus is not, the message of Jesus is not this truncated, like, here's a way to win the, kind of life game or something like that. It's about a way of living that is generative and a blessing to everybody else, to the nations, to our neighbors. And I think that's what's lacking in a lot of Christianity today.
Yeah. Yeah. We say at the table a lot that, we want to be the kind of church where you don't have to believe in order to belong.
I love it.
But not because believing isn't important. Right. It's because we are convinced that believing happens through and because you belong both to a people and to a God. And so that's actually a statement that of the order, not the importance.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So just to circle back to that paper, I think Tommy at the time, this is early 2000s, Tommy at the time was wrestling at our church. We had the equivalent of sales managers, for lack of a better word. So they were constantly on him, like, how many souls did you save today? So,
oh boy.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm putting it more bluntly and maybe not giving a fair treatment to how, but I certainly felt that when the first time I visited him, it was on a short-term mission trip. It's like, y'all going to go save some souls, like as if it was an inventory, that check. So, but I to your point, doing church is participating in this grand redemption plan. Like we're part of this. We're part of the story. God is going about redeeming his creation, right? Mm-hmm. And we're part of that. Mm-hmm. Individually as well as collectively. So speaking of a recurring theme that you explore on Everything Just Changed, the podcast, mm-hmm. I love the way you put in one of them. I wrote this down. The anti-hero of individualism, which has become the protagonist of American culture. I want to make that a bumper sticker. So can you?
They might have to drive a little too close to be able to read that.
Yeah, right. Well, my brother's favorite bumper sticker is "Jesus may love you, but everybody else thinks you're an asshole." So
exactly.
So can you already have been talking about the distinctions between an individual versus a community mindset, but how it just, if you could share a little bit more contextually how it's fed by contemporary culture and what the ideal balance should look like.
Maybe it would be helpful to even just talk about Brad and I kind of, in some ways, it's like where our friendship began, and certainly where the podcast began was that, he was planting a church in secular, left-leaning, Boulder County, and I was planting a church in kind of conservative, right-leaning Orange County, and yet we kept running into the same issues. And we would ask questions of friends, and it was like Brad was the only person that understood what I was talking about in terms of ministry. And so what we began kind of realizing was that something other than like the principles that people are articulating had to be driving a lot of what's actually going on in our culture, right? Mm-hmm. If I'm dealing with people who are saying, well, it's about, family values and it's about financial responsibility, and yet they're making the same sorts of decisions as people who are articulating more progressive values, then what's actually underneath that? What's actually animating, the way that we live in the world and interact with people? And we sort of just like stumbled backwards into this reality that actually individualism and the idea that we can sort of be the master, like we're living in this choose your own adventure, and it's up to you to find your way towards the ultimate conclusion, that is actually underneath both kind of, the secularism of the right and the left.
That's an interesting way to think of it. So the David French piece from Sunday, that it's a horseshoe, that the two polar opposites.
Oh, he said horseshoe. I didn't read that one yet. Dang it.
Oh man. Yeah. Did you read it, Brad?
Yeah, I did. It was like, yep, this is exactly what we've been talking about.
David French is stealing our theory now, is what you're saying here.
That's pretty much
because he listens to our podcast.
That's right. So, by the way, what prompted you to start the podcast? Everything just changed.
Well, I mean, it was sort of that, what I just was articulating, but then it was really like in the early days of COVID, when our job as pastors went from like, how do we grow church plants, to like, I guess I just do a sermon on a video on Sunday morning. And so Brad and I were talking on the phone, and at one point, I think I was the one who was like, we should just record these things and start a podcast. But
yeah, really, we were just so impressed with our own brilliance as we were talking. We said, oh, somebody else is bound to want to listen to this.
But it was really when, there was the early days of kind of the lockdown and the pandemic, when everybody just stayed home and nobody did anything. And then it wasn't that long before things started being politicized and polarized. And when we started hearing, conservatives complaining about wearing masks and using the phrase "my body, my choice," unironically, it was like, hold on, something is going terribly wrong here.
Yeah.
And, I think we were just trying to find a context in which to give voice to some of the things that we were like, the questions that we were wrestling with, really, because I don't know, we're pastors and we got to talk about it out loud together in order to figure out what we actually think about anything.
That's interesting,
man. Yeah. It's so interesting because, when we planted the table and all the way up until the pandemic, I really felt like I had a good handle on like what the kind of cultural trends are in terms of like where things are going, what people like, what's kind of happening underneath the surface. But what the pandemic did was accelerate whatever cultural and spiritual trajectory we were already on. And I simultaneously, over the last year and a half, and thank God for our podcast, because I'd only feel one of these two things. And the first would be like, wow, I feel like I understand what's happening far more than I actually ever did. But I also feel like I don't have a clue what is coming down the pike or where things are going as a result of that. And so I feel like I don't know, I don't want to speak for Bryce, but like, I feel like I see more clearly now, and I'm a lot more humbled by and less confident about what is coming up. But it is largely a result of both the opportunity and the kind of miraculous resources of people actually saying yes when we ask them to come on our podcast. Like, nobody has told us no yet. So if you're looking to start your podcast, it's remarkable how few people actually turn you down if you're like, hey, can we make you the center of attention for a solid hour and talk about what you love talking about most? Turns out they're really happy to do that. But also, like, the podcast has really just given us the excuse to wrestle with what we're seeing day to day. And now we have a reason to ask people beyond like, hey, I'm just a random pastor who wants to talk to you and pick your brain. So
Exactly.
it's really helpful.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it's hard to distill, dozens, if not hundreds of hours of conversations down to, 1 2-minute answer, but any major takeaways so far? What have been some of your biggest epiphanies?
Oh gosh.
I guess I just did ask you to distill hundreds of hours of conversation.
Or pick from the plethora, a single.
Well, you've had some great guests, man. I'm envious of.
I would say maybe two things that I don't know if I would say epiphanies, but just sort of takeaways from, it's been about 18 months that we've been doing the podcast and conversations we've had. And like I said, initially it was Brad and I just kind of like thinking out loud together. And then we've been able to pull some other great conversation partners in and learn from them. I think the two takeaways that I would say, one is just it has really helped me feel much less alone. It's been really fun to see, initially it was just the occasional friend who I guess, stumbled across our podcast. I probably started going like, what do these two yokels know about anything? But they're like friends texting us and going like, wow, you guys are, you're scratching the itch that I didn't quite know was there. And so that's been really fun to see that there are both kind of pastor friends, but there are also, in some ways it's maybe people who are maybe tempted to give up on the church going, okay, there's something going on here that I want to listen to. So it's helped me feel less alone. I think the other thing as I just like take a really big step back and look at the view from 35,000 feet or whatever is I've been thinking a lot about the word integrity lately. And when I look at just everything that has come to light in well, I was going to say in American culture, but especially in the Christian church that the pandemic has revealed, like the word integrity is like just banging in my head because I don't know about you. I sort of grew up with this idea that integrity is about moralism or more morality, right? People with integrity, like you don't tell lies, like, gosh darn it, just try harder, be better, like be a good person. But integrity, the word integrity comes from the word integer, which means wholeness. So if a truck drives over a bridge and the bridge collapses, it's because that bridge didn't have integrity, right? It wasn't whole. And I think one of the things that has just been revealed in the Christian church, and we've had numerous conversations and gotten at this in different ways in the podcast, is just the extent to which the Christian church in America lacks integrity. Not in the sense that everybody's a liar, although, we've seen that too, but there's sort of like a two-facedness to Christianity, a lack of wholeness, a lack of, being the same person in every context. And so again, this goes back even to what I was saying about what your question about what does it mean to follow Jesus, that if Jesus's claims about who he was are true, that's got to reorient everything about our lives from the ground up. And I think so much of what we're experiencing in the church is about sort of, an attempt to sort of like pursue the American dream while also maintaining belief in Christian principles. And that is not a position of integrity. That is a position that's pulling the church apart and is pulling individuals apart. And I think we've just been able to explore that in a lot of different ways. And I think in more hopeful ways than the way I just described it too. So
Brad, would you add anything to that? Like, have you had epiphanies or discoveries that so far?
Yeah. Gosh, like Bryce said, it's hard to narrow this down, but as a whole, I think the relationship between individualism and institutions is very interesting and important for us to be thinking about going forward, because as individualism has become a more significant cultural factor and influence, institutions have decreased at least on pace and on par. And so, it used to be, we even use the language of brick and mortar institutions, but historically speaking, institutions have been like the shelter that we are able to take refuge in the midst of the weather, the cultural weather changing or climate changing. Except as individualism becomes more prevalent, then our distrust of those brick and mortar institutions goes away. But in has slipped this, this thing we call social media, right? Which instead of, being a brick or mortar refuge is this network of like almost spider web like connections where you can be as connected to people as you want to be from across the globe. And the distance has shrunk. But the problem with that is instead of protecting you from change, you are far more sensitized to it and it reverberates along those threads. And now, like, yes, we're more connected, but it's serving as a counterfeit institution in the sense that like, you're expressing, it's for expression, not formation. Like you're not being shaped. You are being fed a lie that you are doing the one shaping, but you're not the spider, you're lunch. Right. And that is like, socially speaking, profoundly anxiety inducing. Yeah. And that anxiety, along with, whether you're talking about negative polarization, tribalism, politicization of everything, like that's part of what's driving all of that. And what's needed, and I think this is the optimistic,
That's my next question. Yeah.
Trajectory that Bryce was talking about is we need more greenhouses. We need more an approach to institutions that resemble not brick or mortar of old, but not the spider web either, but greenhouses where you're not just being sheltered from the outside. It's actually facilitating growth. It's flourishing anyone who comes in, and not for the sake or purpose of staying inside, but being sent out and planting itself and putting roots in other places. So it has a purpose that exists not just for itself or for those who are inside it. It exists for the purpose of like blessing and flourishing the world externally as well. And we're going to say that we're going against the grain right now to want to build those kinds of institutions is an understatement. But I'm convinced more and more that that's the only thing that gets us out of that mess.
Interesting. As an amateur sociologist, and from where you're sitting as a pastor, why in the world are these conversations so hard?
Besides the pandemic?
Well, no,
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking about this question in terms of, I don't know if you've been following, Facebook changed their name to Meta.
Meta, yeah.
And all of this conversation around the metaverse is really interesting. One of the concerns I've heard expressed about that is the way that it will impact particularly like poor and vulnerable communities, in the sense that it provides an addictive outlet that anesthetizes the pain of modern life. And I think that is an exponential increase from the way that we functionally use social media as escape. But what we're escaping to is actually more subtly so, but also more manipulatively so, increasing and harvesting our anxiety by it is actually more subtly, but more manipulatively stoking anxiety in order to harvest our attention. And that is a recipe for escapism. And in social media, we are kind of, we don't know, but none of us actually do that vulnerably. It's not really vulnerable, especially if you're not like in the room with someone, never mind looking at them, a video. Like these are orders of magnitude less vulnerable. And I think we are in a place where we are realizing how much our relational muscles have atrophied.
Yeah.
And it is hard to get off the couch and go for a run when you don't run every day. It is hard legitimately to not yell at each other, because in a lot of ways that emotional escalation is what we kind of subconsciously generate in order to get past the anxiety or the fear we have of putting ourselves out there. And so there's just a lot of like deep psychological challenges that systemically, like everything is making that harder right now. And has been for a while, but I think we're only just now able to see it and articulate it.
Bryce, did you have anything to add to that? Why are these conversations so hard to have?
A lot of it, I think, is based on what I was saying about integrity. a minute ago. I think that some of it is we are of two minds. We kind of have this idea that we should be nice to each other. We should be able to converse with people who disagree with us. But then we just kind of want to be right. Some of it just comes down to like, no, I don't want to like talk politics and religion without killing you. Like I want to talk politics and religion in such a way that you agree with me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, right. I mean, that's the individualism part too, right? It's not that you just disagree with me. My identity is on the line that for me to be right.
Yeah. And so it's not like, it's not the case that like I have a few principles in my life that I'm committed to, and yet I'm looking for conversation part to help further, refine my ideas and help me learn more. And so when somebody disagrees with me, it's an opportunity to test what I believe and to maybe, be corrected. It's not that at all. It's like, I mean, if anything, not to make everything about social media, but social media reveals just how petty some of the things that we get worked up about are. If I post a picture of something and I don't get the number of likes that I want, I'm frustrated by it. And I think that's what's happening in a lot of ways. It's like everything is now something to be outraged about.
Right. Right. Yeah. I noticed that play out the other day. I posted something. I thought I was posting in favor of free expression and objecting to those. It was about Chappelle. And I was objecting to those who deplatform him because they didn't like his content, and it became something that went beyond just not liking the way he presented his argument. In fact, I think a lot of folks who had the biggest issue with him never actually watched the special. But my post was about supporting free expression. Well, there were a bunch of people who wanted to talk about it that began to comment. And then one person in particular came in with heavy artillery. And it wasn't just critiquing Chappelle's performance. It was turning it into something that was so antagonistic that it was inspiring not just hatred, but violence, and also intimating that my support of Chappelle, it wasn't really that. Not that it was neither here nor there, but my support was also inspiring hatred and violence. So after that comment, and then I got into I tried to talk with this person because she's a friend, and but what I noticed was nobody else was commenting after that. Because somebody came in with heavy artillery, and that person then, or that, it wasn't necessarily that person, it was that tenor, that note. Yeah. There was no other conversation that could have been had at that point.
Yeah. So I think in a lot of ways, that's the effect of individualism. It's you're not attacking an idea, or we're not discussing ideas. You're attacking me as a person, and you're doing violence against me. And so, that's, I suppose, the justification for the illiberalism of saying, no, we're not even going to talk about this now.
Well, yeah, because the more we lack healthy embodied relationships where those relational muscles don't atrophy, the more disembodied we are by social media, the more words like disembodied violence feels like a threat. And like Bryce said, if our identity is on the line and it's not just a disagreement, then it kind of actually makes sense that some people would experience it that way. That's actually damning, not necessarily of like we can have the conversation where that's damning of their individual attitude. And yes, it is, but we can't just stop there. This is a systemic individualism that is kind of tearing us apart and making room for that kind of thing. So that's like a perfect illustration.
Yeah. Well, and I think the tragedy, again, as pastors and as Christians, is that I really believe that Christianity provides the resources to move beyond that, because Christianity says your identity is not rooted in who you are or what you've achieved, but your identity is actually rooted in the person of Jesus and what he has done. And so we don't have to be defensive. We don't have to win. To be a Christian means that you've kind of become a Christian by admitting that you've already lost and you've already failed. And so the tragedy is that in the moment that we're living through, Christians aren't behaving that way.
Ooh, yeah,
Which means that something other than what we say is the center of our faith is actually operational in our lives.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we can really look at our, friends and neighbors who aren't Christians and be, super frustrated that culturally these conversations go the way that they do, because I don't know that we can really expect anything different. If you have to justify your existence in that way, then of course you're going to defend yourself tooth and nail, but Christians shouldn't need to do that. And the fact that that's what's happening so often is tragic.
Yeah. The pandemic, and combined with the ongoing and then escalating culture wars, has really been the stress test for the evangelical church.
Exactly.
That has really exposed how true that is, and how nominal or merely cultural a lot of the church, the white evangelical American church's Christianity actually is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I just want to encourage you fellas, what you're doing with the podcast and everything that I've seen about the table. You are part of the solution from what I've been able to just tell, in that unlike other churches I've seen, or when I've gotten into these types of conversations, what you're inviting people into, whether it's listeners to your podcast or folks at your church, you're inviting them into something. You're not convincing them of a transaction, but you're inviting them into a conversation. You're inviting them into a project. You're inviting them into even a way of life, in a way, not to make it out to be, cultish. It's just, you're inviting them to the table. So it's
well, I do think we are hopefully inviting people into a way of life, but it's not about following us as much as it is about the way of life of following Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, that reminds me, and this, everything we've been talking about, like there's this passage in Joshua, at the end of Joshua chapter 5, that just haunts me. And it's where Joshua is approaching, and Israel is approaching Jericho, and they're getting ready to attack it. And Joshua sees this angel, and it says it's the angel of the Lord. So it's like likely a pre-incarnate Jesus, but he approaches this angel, and it says, he asks him, are you for us or for our adversaries? And the angel says, no.
Oh,
no, but I am the commander of the Lord's army, and now I have come. And it says, Joshua fell on his face, fell on the earth, and worshiped, and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? So Joshua recognizes that this is God come down to how should we say this? Reject the premise of his question and the false dichotomy.
Right.
And I think Bryce and I's hope is just like, hey, let's pay attention to when God says, no, you're both wrong on the culture wars. The problem is not, am I on your side? It's, are you on mine?
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting
And he does that not with violence, but with love and grace. And that is what is lacking, obviously, in the culture wars.
Yeah. So often I think that I just think that we need to be reminded that Christ's path to victory was through the cross, right? So I know we're up against it time-wise. So 2 more questions. One is, and you can each answer this. Do you have any questions for me?
Yeah. So, I mean, Corey, why would we want to talk politics and religion without killing each other? Why is that even a noble goal?
I mean, that's my question too, because as we've been talking about this entire time, that's kind of hard right now.
Yeah.
So are you masochistic? Why is it worth it to you?
Well, the illustration I shared a couple minutes ago is the reason, is that I really think that there's a lot of folks who want to be able to talk about this stuff, but can't, because the conversation is being dictated by the loudest, most extreme voices. And if you express anything that is 1 degree shy of absolute orthodoxy, in my friend's case, I hate to distill it down to the word woke, but like anything short of pure enlightenment of whatever her belief in, it's like a moving target. So it's hard to even talk about, but, or other friends from church, if you're, if you even ask the question about, this Trump character, he's not our guy. Is he really our guy? Even asking that question, you'll get kicked out of Bible studies. You might even get kicked out of certain churches. So I think that most people, not whether it's most or there's a lot of folks who want to ask these questions, who want to talk about this stuff, but can't because of the temperature of the room right now. Right. So that's kind of what we're doing. I guess in a way we're creating I was going to say a gated community of sorts, but it's like a multicultural, multi-generational gated community, somewhat of a safe space, but it doesn't necessarily need to be safe. We can have dangerous conversations, but safe in a way that I still affirm your humanity. I still affirm your dignity as a human being, So.
So maybe since Brad piggybacked on my question, my follow-up would be how are you doing that? Because, I think there's a lot of, illiberal ways we could do that, right? Where we could say like, we're going to have this conversation until people start shouting and then we just turn off the tech. Or we could say only certain people are allowed in the conversation. But if we want to have genuine conversations, like you said, that are sometimes dangerous with people who genuinely disagree about things that really matter, how do you navigate those conversations?
Well, it starts close to home. I start the first couple episodes were just me and my dad talking, because I don't know if guys know this about my story, but I grew up in a very observant Jewish family. We went to an Orthodox synagogue. We, just kept kosher, observed all the holidays. We weren't like once a year Jews. We were Jewish. My family still is Jewish. I consider myself still Jewish. So when I became a Christian and I affirmed the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that was a big deal. And it was, to say that it was hard to talk about with my dad in particular is the understatement of the year. So I just started close to home, having difficult conversations. Now it's 20 plus years on. So we've learned how to navigate these issues, and we've had a lot of these conversations, but we're still talking, So start there. Some of the early guests that I invited, again, were folks that I knew disagreed with me on critical issues, politically, theologically. So it's just a good exercise to do that, and then subsequently, a lot of the guests that we've had on are more sort of teaching us how to do it. Like you guys had Michael Ware, we had Michael Ware on as well. Folks like that. We just talked to Russell Moore this week.
Awesome.
Just a wealth of knowledge, or going at it, not from a religious point of view, but from what's going on in our culture. Like, I hate the idea that so many folks just have this generality of, well, you can't trust the media. Like, really? Is that a total statement? Categorically, like you can't trust so we have on reporters on a regular basis. We had on Jake Sherman. We just released that episode this week.
That was great.
Thank you. He's a great reporter, and there's great journalism. And by the way, there are great reporters at Breitbart. There are great reporters at Washington Post. There's great commentary happening on all different. So I probably answered more of your question than you bargained for, but any other questions? I could come on to, everything just changed and make sure that you never have any listeners ever again. so you can ask me a lot more questions. No, but speaking of which, how can we find more information about you, more information about the table, and everything just changed?
Yeah, I mean, we can include the link to the podcast in the show notes. We have a Substack that we occasionally write for, kingandkingdom.community, as well as a Facebook page that we are just starting up to kind of facilitate and create a space for conversation, because we think it's actually really important, despite the fact that I am still convinced that Facebook is the Dr. Evil of social fabric. So
we are convinced that it is theoretically possible to have a meaningful, interchange on a social media platform, and we're going to try that. And so, we're doing that. And but just search for Everything Just Changed anywhere you get podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcast, etc. We're all over those places.
That's awesome. And on the website, I love that chart that opens up the king, no king, kingdom, no kingdom. That's a great, it's very thought-provoking. So really appreciate you fellas coming in and spending the time. I held you a little bit longer than I planned, but there's so much more to talk about. I want to have you back. So
yeah, well, we enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having us. This was fun.
Yeah, man. Absolutely. Thank you.
And as always, if you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, leave us a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts. And most importantly, tell a friend about us. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week. Thank you for joining us today. If you appreciate what you've heard here, please go to iTunes or anywhere you get your podcasts, give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. That really helps move us up the chart so others can find out what we're up to here. For Ronnie Nathan, I'm Corey Nathan, and we've been talking politics and religion without killing each other. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.